Did you know that 46% of CFOs are going to take a cost-cutting approach to pandemic recovery? And only 1 in 5 board members claim to have experience with brand marketing. Hi, I'm Whittaker. As an analyst, I've been invited by JCDecaux to bring you key pieces of macroeconomic research and insight that gives senior marketeers the guidance and practical advice on how to plan marketing strategies to become change agents in your organization. Today, we're bringing the first series of this podcast to a close with an incredibly important case study. I'm delighted to be chatting with Mark Evans, Managing Director of Marketing and Digital at Direct Line Group. Direct Line has been through a huge change process to demonstrate the value of advertising and have successfully put marketing on the boardroom agenda. All of this has been led by Mark, who has been with the group since 2012 and has brands like Mars and HSBC on his record. Mark also features on the Campaign Power 100 list, who describe him as a leader who genuinely cares. Mark, thanks very much for joining. I mean, it's great to have you on. Particularly as, the work you've done at Direct Line, I think very much a lot of people would see really as the poster, a poster child, if you don't mind me calling you that. So for how marketing should be done in an organization and how somebody in control of marketing persuades the board that actually it is such a strategically crucial function on things.
Well, it's very good to hear it. I would say the job is never done.
Yeah.
Because it's a bit of a weakest link thing. Marketing's reputation in an organisation, that job to convince the rest of the organisation that marketing is anything other than a colouring in function, that job is never done.
Yeah. And that description of colouring in function, it plays to so many particular themes that, marketing's always seen as a cost. It's always seen as, we have this situation now where obviously there are economic uncertainties around, not necessarily being reflected in company results, which in Q1 seem to be pretty much dominated by many companies saying top line is actually stronger than expected. But you do have a situation where I think it's 46% of CFOs have said that cost cutting potentially could be a priority during this downturn. How do you, in that position, what would be the arguments that you would use to your board in that position to say, yes, there's an obvious thing here to say cut marketing because it's an immediate cost saving and there's a question mark about where the consumer is at the moment. What would be the arguments you would use to CFOs, CEOs, boards as to say, hold on, that's a very short-term approach. This is not the thing that we should be doing.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. The role of the marketer is to bring the outside in, bring the future forward and guard against short-term thinking in many regards. And in that sense, that impact is built upon having built credibility so that people get that you're commercially astute and have the commercial interests in the business rather than fanciful brand building. But from that position of influence, and frankly, if you are on the exco or the board, you can have these conversations direct. I mean, the argument at one level is quite straightforward. If you don't invest in brands, you won't have a business in 5 years' time. But of course, that you need to put a bit more substance underneath that. And in the end, that means that we do look to prove out the ROI on our brand building activity and maintain that. And then, but of course, you've got to show up for the cost cause. And so we would moderate up and down the performance spend, but actually investing in the long-term health of the brands is the constant. But that has to be built upon a belief that brand building is an important thing and a value-add thing and an investment rather than a cost. And to an extent, the performance marketing part of the budget is a cost.
Yeah.
Because it's the cost of acquisition to get people through the door. But it's a slightly different mentality in terms of brand building in that it is an investment for future return. And so, I think any marketer worth their salt will be championing that long-term thinking to hold a balance in these really difficult times.
And it's interesting what you said about you keep the brand spending constant and really where the variance is on the performance marketing side. Because often what you hear from companies, I think it was Kazoo, for example, was saying in their statement, talking about how it would be the brand spending that would be cut and the performance marketing that would be maintained. And that seems to be I'm not of specifically singling out that company, but often you hear that essentially when if they're going to cut the advertising, the focus seems to be on let's maintain the performance marketing, but actually cut the brand spending. But
I have to say I largely disagree. It might vary by sector.
Yeah.
But to an extent, it works out. So performance marketing will be a function of the cost of advertising, the amount of shopping and switching and buying that's in the market, the weight or the intensity of the bid in the auction on Google, for example. And so to some extent, if you're on your ROIs, it self-equilibrates because you don't want to invest beneath an ROI of 1, so you will self-limit your spend. And so to headlessly, recklessly spend at an inflated cost of acquisition and a reduced ROI, that's what gets marketing into trouble. On the flip side, brand spend, I mean, we have to go back to the neuroscience of marketing, which is wanting to create mental availability by continually reminding those stored memory structures in people's heads of this is a brand that I'm aware of and that I would consider. And so through the eyes of Ehrenberg, Bass and Byron Sharp and how brands grow, that would say you need to be always on from a brand building point of view because it's constantly topping up. So at least in our sector, I see it completely the other way around.
Right, okay, that is interesting. I mean, it's funny what sort of mentioned about that sort of the always on, as it were, with brand spending. I mean, one of the ways that I've always viewed, particularly brand advertising, is the phrase that I've used is intangible capex. You know, this whole idea that like a firm actually builds a factory in order to actually drive sales, it does the same sort of thing as well with its brand. But also as well, there's this whole thing is you don't just have to build the factory, you have to maintain it. And if you don't maintain it, then what happens is over time, it runs down and the cost of replacement is actually so much greater than what it would have been.
Yeah, and this is now measurable. So in our 2018 IPA paper that we got 2 golds for, we were able to, across our portfolio where we've had various levels of brand spend over time, have enough rich data to start to pull apart what is the decay factor of dropping back on brand spend. What's the sort of, from an airplane metaphor, once you lose cruising altitude, how much more petrol do you burn to get back to cruising altitude? And ultimately, we produced this model which mashed up our econometrics with our brand tracking to understand the short and the long-term ROI on our brand spend. And I think a couple of the econometrics agencies have since followed suit and provide that as a service. But absolutely, it shows the return on brand spend, and so even with the long term bit, you can talk numbers with the board, and so we can say yes, for every £1 we switch from performance spend to brand spend within year, the reduction in ROI is maybe a 0.3, but over 2 years it's plus 0.6. And I think that changes the whole conversation, and buys you a bit of latitude for some of those bits which are subjective and intuitive, because a board or an exec will have confidence that you know your numbers straightforwardly.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point that about the confidence in terms of when it comes to the numbers, because one of the things that have come out from surveys is to say that only 1 in 5 board members feel as though they have brand experience, and obviously for many board members who don't have that knowledge about the importance of brand, they look at it because of the accounting treatment, because everything else, they look at it at a cost, and if they don't understand sort of what's going on, the natural inclination is to cut it. What do you how do you find in terms of the most useful tools for actually persuading other board members who might not be so experienced when it comes to brand, that yes, this is important? And you've touched on them before in terms of the studies and so forth. Is it the language that's important? Is it the data? Is it of what exactly is it?
So it is those things. It's also not falling into the stereotypical traps. So I once had some very good advice a few years ago saying, if you really love your advertising, if you think it's amazing, show your mum or your dad or your friends. Don't show it to the board.
Right.
As a rule of thumb, try to avoid having a communication conversation with the board, because they may or may not be impressed. The downside is they start tinkering with your creative platform and so on. So actually don't go with that. Go with the numbers, lead with the numbers. And so very practically, we have a large non-exec board, and there's a bit of a revolving door because, of course, they have a fixed tenure. And so when we do non-exec inductions, we show them the econometrics.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's analysis that they get and understand, and methodologies that they're familiar with. And it does 2 things. One is it says, we talk in numbers. We don't talk in crayons. And also it demonstrates the value.
Yeah.
And I think there's this notion which is that there's a cuts queue. There's always a cuts queue. The cuts queue is growing right now.
Yeah.
But it's always there. Unless marketing's careful, it will be at the front of the cuts queue. And the job is to slowly but surely move back a place, and get to the back of the the cuts queue. And so for me, one of the best things I heard last year was from one of our finance leads, which is I can't make any promises, but it will be the last place that we come if we need to find more in our cost objectives for 2021. So I think that's quite a big signal. But it does all come back to avoid the stereotypes, the archetypes, those self-inflicted wounds, and always lead with an investment case.
Yeah, and it's so important because at the end of the day, it all comes down to, for listed companies anyway, for all companies, delivering shareholder value, and really tying in where marketing fits into that end game. And certainly from an outside perspective, what we'd look at is exactly that sort of point before with the crayons. That there's a risk sometimes that what happens is marketers speak in a different language to the board and a different set of priorities. Yeah. And really that's the sort of thing that is going to get you to the front of the queue when it comes to cuts.
Yeah, and an interesting twist on this conversation is that many marketers are picking up customer experience as a folding into their remit maybe. The chief marketing officer role is archetypally built around that, and I would say most chief marketers, if they're not in some way responsible for architecting the customer experience, then they're only doing half of the job that's required. But again, there's this fallacy that customer experience is some sort of hedonistic pursuit of some utopian state for all customers at all times. And of course, that's, again, portrays your intent as fantasy. And so, again, what we've done is to prove the case. So we can prove the causality and correlation between NPS and retention. In our case, insurance retention is really critical. So from a 0 to a 10 NPS, we can say exactly what the delta is on retention across sales and service and also across our claims journeys. And so then you can get to the value of a 1% increase in NPS is X. Therefore, this is why you need to invest either in the transformation of some of those journeys or bolstering some of those journeys or whatever it is. But again, it's sort of computational, it's mathematical, it's modeled to say, here's the investment case. So, it's great that marketing's remit is expanding, but again, it's weakest link stuff. And if you get all hedonistic and fantastical on customer experience, again, it undermines your credibility as a commercial leader in the organization. So I guess I'm a bit jaundiced because I was an economist, or I did an economics degree and corporate strategy and was destined for a career in banking. And so I guess I'm not your average marketer, but my worst fear is being seen as commercially lightweight.
Right, okay.
And so I rail against that, and hence we've built a really kick-ass marketing effectiveness function and kind of never let up.
You actually, on that last point, you actually lead on to the next question I was going to ask was, I think for a lot of people who would be listening to this would say, the results of what you've done are fantastic. It sounds great that you managed to persuade the board. I get the overall concept. What do I need to do here from a practical standpoint when it's, for example, a marketer who may be in an organisation where maybe the board doesn't really take the marketing department as seriously as it should, and maybe thinking, okay, how can I change that around? What are the steps that I need to do in order to sort of change that perception?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a path we took. It took a few years. The trickiest bit is in the first 18 months, which for any CMO or any exec, it's a bit of a survival job. You've got to show early impact. CMO tenure, I think, on average is sort of 18 months or something crazy. So, that's partly is getting through that survival job. But the investment in the marketing effectiveness team to build the modelings, to build the econometrics is a really core part of that. And so, many companies won't have an out-and-out marketing effectiveness function, and they maybe rely on the media agency to do that. Okay. But I think the real trick here is the fine balance between having a marketing effectiveness function that is a critical friend of the marketing function itself. So having a marketing effectiveness function which is a critical friend of the marketing function, but sits within.
Right, okay.
Because typically you would say it needs to sit in an external function, otherwise it's marking their own marketing their own homework. But there's no doubt that the real impact of marketing effectiveness team is working within the process. So I think there's a sort of, you get to a threshold level of credibility for the CMO to own the marketing effectiveness function, and then you get to the sweet spot.
Yeah,
it's the credibility, but also the impact. So yeah, I mean, out and out, having a marketing effectiveness function that's independent but integrated, that's a really interesting part. But more broadly, we are essentially talking about culture.
Right. Okay.
And the kind of obvious thing to say is that many people don't get good commercial grounding at the beginning of their marketing career. And so we set out as one of our team objectives, this is going back 2013, 14, we said ruthless commerciality was our objective. And we invested in that. And even now we're invested in investing in data literacy for the whole team. And slightly funny, odd story where we've named all the rooms after our core objectives, and so there was the ruthless commerciality room. And I remember the FCA came to visit, and they got a bit sweaty about the fact that even marketing doesn't care about customers. No. This is all about our internal credibility. It's fine, we still care, but I think that we want, ultimately want to build rounded marketers. And I go back to my Mars days where, frankly, a lot of this conversation is superseded because it's the way it's set up. Marketing is a strategic function. It is a commercially literate function. And most vice presidents and brand leaders and VP, they're marketers, and the commercial ones at that. But in many organizations, junior marketers don't get that grounding because marketing is defined narrowly as communications. Yeah. So we've had to continually invest in making sure that commerciality is on everybody's PDP, and we stick to that. And
do you think, coming back to that point before in terms of some companies just rely on their agencies to provide that, do you think that one of the issues here potentially also as well is the agencies in terms of their role and maybe either how that's seen by the board or maybe in terms of...
this is where marketing and procurement are kindred spirits, because they can provide another validation that we're getting value for money from our agencies. Because I suspect that there is a preconception, which is to some extent true, that agencies are very, very creative, but maybe not aligned from a commercial objectives point of view. So there's a sort of a golden triangle. So we work very closely with procurement to make sure that things are set up the right way. And also their role is to help us to get aligned objectives. So everybody's got the right skin in the game, shared reward for shared objectives. So there's a bit of a golden triangle there to make sure that we keep our agencies on their toes, give them fair value, but make sure that it is fair value and not more. Because let's be clear, it's pretty tough for agencies. Tough to get talent, and in general, we're in pretty tough times. Advertising may seem buoyant, but it's largely driven by inflation. So I think there's a win-win, but it's procurement play a key role in that.
Right. Okay, that is interesting because obviously sort of agencies, procurement is one of the words that gets mentioned most often, not necessarily in a positive way. I guess one other thing, just on the agency standpoint, which maybe is sort of, I don't know whether it's a slightly unfair question to ask, but I'll ask it anyway in terms of this. It is, do you feel as though your agencies understand the business? And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of information. I always feel that, for example, agencies can find out about their clients, whether it's reading through the annual report or listen to investor calls to see what the main priorities for shareholders, looking at strategic plans and so forth. Do you feel as though agencies sort of, as it were, do that sort of groundwork, or do you think it's more sort of template that is brought in? And
I fundamentally believe you get the agency you deserve.
Right. Okay.
And that job is on the client to make sure that they set their agency up well, including understanding the context. You're right. You would expect them to be diligent and tuned in, and there are lots of means by which they can do that. But to really get between the lines of what's going on, I think that the onus is on the client to make sure that they're not just briefing at creative point, but taking their agencies on a journey, so that it is a shared interest. And the criticality of that is that then they're in a strong position to be an active challenger. And what I really appreciate most about our agencies is it's an active. There's a bit of tension, and they can challenge us and bid us up on things as much as we can them, because they understand the business enough to know where some of the push and pull points are. So, passive sort of head nodding stuff from agencies actually doesn't serve anybody well. But it starts with the client needs to make sure that they are keeping their agencies up to date. And
I just want to sort of flip it back in terms of the conversation. And so you talked about sort of in terms of the marketing department, the commerciality and the sort of crucial steps that take there. Yeah, in terms of the board itself, in terms of as were board members trying to get sort of more knowledgeable about the function, is this very much of a one-way street? Is it so much that it's the marketing department essentially has to educate the board, sort of, or have you found with your board, for example, that there's been more and more of an interest in board members trying to find out what happens with marketing and its importance in the organisation?
Yeah, it varies quite a bit. So some of our non-execs are, because I have to look at an exec and a non-exec level. So, but if I look at, for us, our board is the non-exec board, and there's quite a mixed bag in terms of some are very marketing literate. Adrian Joseph joined our board about a year or so ago. He's amazing around data and AI and ML and tech, and from BT, and so he's very interested in the MarTech side of marketing. Seb James, CEO of Boots Walgreens, is he knows he's a seasoned marketer, came up through the marketing function. So I think it varies, and this is a little bit like, what's at the heart of marketing is to know your customer. And so good, effective networking at a board level. And hey, I'm no expert, and jobs never cracked as such, but is to understand what their hotspots are, what their buttons are, how they personally perceive the marketing function. So it's a classic of know your customer. And lest we forget, kind of everything's marketing, isn't it? In a sense of you want people to think, feel, do certain stuff. So that's got to be based on insight. As you said, there's internal marketing, and sometimes that gets neglected because people don't think necessarily in that way. Now that it's a very interesting point of view as that, and it almost as well approach the board as you would your end consumer, if you want to get what you want. There was when we was coming back, sort of something you mentioned before about return on investment. I guess there's an interesting point of view here as to. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this. When you look at marketing spend, sort of people always talk about return on investment as the main metric. But it almost seems as though what you have is that you have, as you do, two different types of advertising spend, and maybe what you need are two different types of metrics. So if, for example, I come from as mentioned before, I come from a banking background and so forth. And I look at this and I say, okay, performance marketing, return on investment makes sense for that, given its sort of where it's looking at and the timescales involved. If I look at brand investment, I, as an analyst, for example, wouldn't see return on investment as necessarily the best metric. The best valuation metrics you use on brand investment takes over the next couple of years. I'd say something like net present value, net present value, discounted cash flow, whichever way you want to call it, and so forth. And one of the questions I would have is it when it comes to marketing, has the return on investment sort of conversation actually has too much influence? There is a balance for sure. So out and out return on investment performance marketing, that's bank that. As regards brand building, so we track awareness, consideration, preference, intent, and the core brand metrics which signal brand health, brand power. There's any number of brand tracking metrics, and they're, from my point of view, they're crucial to see brand health. Now that's super important, but that doesn't always wash in isolation. What does that mean? So you've increased your consideration by 1%. What does that actually mean? And this is where the integration of the short-term ROI metrics and the brand tracking metrics, and this is this sort of beast of a statistical model that we built to link the two so that you can translate movements in brand metrics into something measurable from a short and a long-term ROI basis. That's where the magic is. So in 2018 we got the new learning award from the IPA for doing that, and it was a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting in doing that, and Ubiquity were a key part of the modelling of that. But that's where the magic is.
Yeah,
it's both in terms of you need both, but also the integration of both, and then you sort of give legitimacy to those brand metrics to the eyes of those who would otherwise be maybe a bit more sceptical.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, it's that importance of having credible data and studies that backs this up. I guess if wanted to end on a note, not even a note, but more of a question. And I think we've touched on a lot of these topics before and so forth, but there will be many marketers out there who'll be thinking, okay, things are changing. What do I need to do? And you mentioned before in terms of what you need to do in terms of the performance marketing, not performance marketing rather, but the credibility, the commerciality of the data and so forth. For those marketers who are looking at things now and wondering, right, what do I need to do sort of to overcome, as it were, the upcoming storm? What would be your advice?
I think a lot of it comes down to, well, there's a number of things, but obviously building the right team and capability to be able to pursue marketing commercially. But I think the key pivot point is just, which we've touched on in a couple of ways, get the right metrics landed. The advent of digitization and digital marketing has meant that there's myriad metrics. And honestly, when I judge a lot of marketing awards, there's a lot of them, like, frankly, who cares? Yeah. But you can get execs and non-execs hooked on the wrong metrics. So what are the metrics that really drive the business outcome? And make sure that those are the ones that you're focusing on, and talk incessantly about them, and let go of some of the things that may still be important metrics. And you always know them yourself, but they're just not the ones you talk about. So it really does come down to talking the language that matters. Yeah, the language of the board, what really matters to them, and what is Thomas Barter in his latest book, The 12 Powers of Marketing Leader or something. What's the value creation zone? Which is ultimately ... What are the metrics that really matter for the business? And I don't think you can go wrong from there, because then you're, if they're in your favor or they're not, at least you having a current currency that people care about. I think that's, the methamphetamine of some of the non-value added metrics. It's just huge distraction. And so, whatever it is, figure that out. Agree that with the CFO and the CEO. Here's all the things I could talk to you about. Here's the things that I think really matter. Do you agree? Okay, well, let's just be incessant on those metrics.
And don't go down a rabbit hole.
Don't go down a rabbit hole.
Don't go, indeed. Mark, that's been absolutely superb. Thanks very much. Thanks for taking the time. It's been great.
Pleasure. Happy to be involved. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm delighted to let you know that we will be back with a second series of this podcast. I'll be continuing the conversation with more advertising change agents on how marketers can inspire change of their own and navigate the macroeconomic landscape. Stay tuned. We hope you enjoyed listening, and wherever you get your podcasts, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. For further resources, downloadable slides, and more information on all the topics covered in our podcasts, visit changemakers.jcdecaux.co.uk. You'll also find my short e-learning series there on how to speak the language of the CFO on the JCDecaux Digital Academy. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.